Hey everyone who's joined, good afternoon and welcome to the podcast download presented by Cumulus Media and Signal Hill Insights. The highlights presented today are from our spring report, the 16th edition of our study that are focused on weekly podcast consumers. I'm Michael Levy, Director of Digital Partnerships here at Westwood One, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Today we'll be covering three topics: podcast consumption on streaming platforms and smart TVs, podcast consumers' receptivity to ads, and the latest on podcast watchers. At the end of the webinar, we've saved time to answer any questions you may have. Please type your questions in the chat box and our presenters will address them during the Q&A. This report and video will be sent to all attendees next week. You'll be able to find both the report and the video posted on the Westwood One blog, where you can also subscribe to our weekly audio insights newsletter. Before we begin, I'd love to introduce you to the Cumulus Podcast Network. The Cumulus Podcast Network is part of Cumulus Media, an audio-first media company delivering premium content to over 250 million people every month over our broadcast, streaming, and podcast platforms, both on the national and local level. The Cumulus Podcast Network is one of the largest podcast networks in America, with more than 43 million downloads a month and over 12 million monthly unique listeners. We have an enormous variety of podcasts across key content pillars such as news, business, money and tech, sports, and lifestyle and entertainment. Across all of our platforms, we're working with our advertising partners in a variety of different ways, utilizing our talent and their engaged audiences to deliver successful and integrated brand campaigns. Now for an intro of our presenters. First up is Paul Riismandel, President and CEO of Signal Hill Insights. Paul has been researching and sharing why and how podcast advertising works since the dawn of the industry. With past experience at Midroll Media and Stitcher, Paul now leads the development of insights at Signal Hill to drive the podcasting industry forward. Next is Liz Mayer, Senior Insights Manager here at Cumulus Media and Westwood One. As an integral part of the Audio Active Group, Liz works on advertiser studies, creating data-backed stories for brands and agencies to prove marketing effectiveness. And now Liz will kick off this exciting study.
Thanks, Mike. So in this webinar, we're going to be discussing a few points. The first being the latest data in YouTube and video podcast consumption. We also have the use of smart TVs for podcast consumption and video streaming services emerging within the podcast space. We have how podcast ad tolerance has changed over time and the differences between listening to indie versus popular podcasts. Then we will close it with our takeaways and recommendations. So for the methodology of this study, we are on our exciting 16th installment of the series. And this report goes back to July 2017. We conduct it twice a year. We conduct this twice a year in both the spring and fall. And this is a nationally representative sample of 600 respondents who meet the following criteria. We have they are persons who are 18 years or older. They have spent at least 1 hour listening to or watching podcasts within the past week. And they are not employed in the advertising, public relations, marketing, market research, AM/FM radio, television, digital, or podcasting industries. And these surveys were conducted from April 21st to 27th, 2026. It's important to note that this is the 8th wave where respondents could qualify for the study by saying that they watched a podcast in the past week. So where there is trending, this is noted on which studies have included watching podcasts in addition to just listening. So who's listening? Well, according to Edison Research's Infinite Dial 2026, those who listen to or watch podcasts for more than 1 or more hours a week represent 45% of America. And our heavy podcast listeners, those are going to be those who consume podcasts for 6 or more hours a week. They represent 36% of America. Now, as we talk about watching podcasts, it's important to note that listening is still an important experience for a majority of podcast consumers. Only a tiny minority only watch podcasts. Now, when we talk about watching podcasts, what do we mean? When we say watching podcasts, we mean those who have consumed a podcast with a video component in the past week. Now, for our sample, those who have listened and watched in the past week, that represents 80% of our sample. And those who have only listened in the past week represent 13%, leaving those who have only watched a podcast in the past week at 8%. This shows that 92% of podcast consumers say they are listening to at least some podcasts in the past week, showing that audio is still an important part of podcasting. And we see this trended over the past couple of years. Over the past 4 years, podcast watching only has remained consistent at around 9% over the last 4 years. We see some outliers, but it has remained relatively stable. And this is important to know as we get into the podcast watching as an established segment of podcast consumption. When we trend those where people prefer to listen to or watch podcasts, we see that the audio only without any video has decreased over the past 4 years. So this has gone from 42% to just 21% over the last 4 years. And those two brackets of playing video in the background or consuming podcasts with audio only, the joint consumption of 70% has gone to 51% in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's also notable here, Liz, that, parallel with that, we see the increase in the preference to watch. And certainly there's probably some relationship as there become more podcasts that are available to watch and they show up in people's feeds. They're going to prefer to watch them. But that is notable. It's a fair amount of change in just 4 years.
That's a great point, Paul. And when we look at what we are seeing in the podcast download, we are actually going to compare it to what advertisers believe is happening and what consumers prefer and how to consume their podcasts. So we see that 49% of people prefer to actively watch, but advertisers believe that only 29% of people prefer to actively watch, with the majority, 43%, preferring audio-only podcast consumption. And this comes from our advertiser perception study of agencies and advertisers from July 2025.
And this kind of reflects what I hear from people in the industry when I go to conferences and I have conversations. I think often, even inside the podcast industry, our perception lags behind what's really going on. I think sometimes it's a little bit of denial, wanting to really recognize how much consumers are now preferring to actively watch video. But part of it is just simply paying attention to the research and following it and believing it. And so it's something, and it's a clear trend we can see over these course of these last 4 years, as you showed in the last slide, Liz, that I think anyone who is buying podcast ads, who is selling podcast ads, who is anywhere in the industry should be paying attention to it.
Yeah, Paul, and I think we really need to take the me out of media. As people in the industry, we think that everyone consumes the same way we do, and we don't really understand what's happening in the total population of the country. And that's why studies like these are so important, so that we can understand what's happening outside of what we believe is happening.
Well said.
And while we see that people prefer to actively watch, I think it's still important to notice that people are still listening to the audio without watching, even if they prefer to. So this is the average percent of time spent accessing podcasts on YouTube. And we can see that while 56% of the time people say that they are watching the video while listening, that still leaves 44% of the time listening to the audio without watching. And when we look at podcast watching, well, the question is, what is this replacing? And when we look at what activities podcast watching is replacing, surprisingly, it's not podcast listening. It's actually non-podcast activities. So we have that net number of non-podcast activities with an extremely high number of 93%. And we can see this broken out. And we see one of the number one things being replaced by is watching TV. And then we have scrolling on social media, listening to music, more social video. And I think that this is extremely important because it's not replacing podcast listening, it's an addition to podcast listening.
Absolutely. As I've been watching this trend that we've been detecting over the last 3 to 4 years of video podcasting becoming more and more popular with consumers, my interpretation has been that video has been a net plus for podcasting, that it is part of the engine of audience growth. And I think we can see that here, that people are adding video podcasts to their diet instead of watching television or other video activities. And only a fifth are saying that they're replacing any time with their audio podcasts. So this is not something to fear. There is not cannibalization going on. Video has been an opportunity for podcasting from an audience growth standpoint, and we should not see it as a threat.
Well said, Paul. And when we look at podcast consumption on YouTube, which notoriously famous for being able to watch podcasts in addition to listen, we see that over 90% of those who are consuming podcasts on YouTube are watching at least half of it. And actually, those who are watching at least 3/4 of it represent 75% of the sample.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of discussion in popular media, and I think we all talk about the erosion of attention spans and the sort of scrolling mindset. But what this demonstrates is that video podcast consumers also like long form and have the ability to pay attention. And podcasts are serving that. What I would say is a takeaway here, and we'll talk a little bit more later about it, is looking at this, it does show that, you probably want to have the biggest, meatiest part of what you have to talk about and to deal with in your podcast, have that in the first half. But it does look like people are staying tuned in. So it looks like through all of this, the trend that you can see that's very clear at this point, and we're going to put a little bit more evidence behind, is that, video podcasts and YouTube have solidified their popular standing. They remain popular. So let's look at where YouTube stands now in terms of people's preferences. Something that we first detected going back to 2023 is that YouTube came into the #1 spot in being the platform consumers tell us they use the most for their podcast consumption. And that trend continues unabated in terms of growth. We see that as of April of this year, 44% of weekly podcast consumers tell us they use YouTube most for their podcasts. We see now that only 14% are telling us they use Spotify, whereas 5% are telling us that they're using Apple Podcasts. What else do you see here, Liz?
Paul, I think the most interesting thing to me is that since 2019, Spotify has actually remained relatively stable. Sure, it went up a little bit in the 2022 area, and it went back down. But what's really causing the erosion what's really eroding is Apple Podcasts. They were the top dog in podcasting in 2019. They had a 29% for most used podcast consumption. And that has gone down all the way to 5%, as you mentioned, which means that as YouTube is growing, it's not necessarily eating away from Spotify. It's more so eating away from Apple as the most used platform.
Yeah, and I think one thing we have to keep in mind here is that there's been tremendous growth in the podcast audience between 2019. And we have to think a little bit about devices, which you're going to get into in a minute, and that Apple Podcasts is most prominent on an Apple device, on an iPhone, on a Mac OS computer, or on an iPad, and is not so prominent on on other brand of tablet, on a Windows PC, or on an Android phone. So certainly I think that is at least responsible for this. So I think it's not so much that necessarily Apple has lost a lot of share, but as the audience has grown, Apple has not continued to claim more new consumers choosing its platform. And we're going to see some interesting things on this next slide, I think. So what's interesting here is that YouTube persists no matter the tenure of how long someone's been listening or watching podcasts. Now, if you would ask me without ever having seen this data, what did I think we'd see? I actually would have assumed that the podcast newcomers were choosing YouTube to use more so than folks who've been listening 4 years or more. But as it turns out, they're actually choosing it a little bit less. Whereas we see that it's about the same for people who've been listening to or using podcasts for 4 years or more. It seems like choosing YouTube is not a factor of how long you've been into podcasting. What else do you see here, Liz?
Yeah, so I see, the big three as a whole, podcast newcomers are listening less. Now, we do ask about other podcast platforms, but they're still so small, even amongst the newcomers, that they don't really reach the big three. But it is interesting that we're starting to see the big three come down in the newcomers, specifically Spotify over the last couple of years. Even in the fall, it was just 7%. So we're starting to see a little bit of decrease there as well.
Yeah, I think some of this is really starting to go to social as people are consuming podcasts, essentially content from their favorite podcasters on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook. Again, I think it's an emerging trend that we're going to pay attention to as we go into fall, into the next iteration of the download. But it's something to pay attention to, and very specifically for any networks, any podcasters out there to pay attention to in your own stats to see, where else are we seeing growth and people paying attention to us?
Yes, it's certainly something to look out for, Paul.
And so what this kind of adds up to is that platform is not destiny. It's important to watch and know where podcast consumers are watching and listening. But let's say YouTube, which has become the one most used, we're finding that people consume those same podcasts elsewhere. So when we ask YouTube podcast consumers, think of all those podcasts that you're watching there. Do you ever listen to them in another place? And a clear majority say they do. 58% are saying, yes, I've got podcasts that I'm watching on YouTube, and I'm also catching them on another platform. Whereas a strong minority, 42%, said, no, I'm pretty much watching them on YouTube. And then we asked them, so when you listen to those podcasts somewhere besides YouTube that you otherwise also consume on YouTube, why do you do that? And, the results are fairly obvious. They basically tell us there are times when I can only listen, right? when I can't be watching a screen, when I'm in a vehicle, and maybe if you're driving that vehicle, you shouldn't be looking at a screen. When you want to have the device lock activated, which can make it difficult to watch on YouTube. Or you're just using a different app. Maybe you're on Spotify because you've been listening to music. Now you want to go to podcasts. You don't want to change apps. So you flip over to a podcast. That's pretty obvious and straightforward. Liz, what else? How else do you interpret this data?
I think it really comes down to time and place.
Hmm.
As humans, we are constantly on the go. Now, we would all love to sit down and watch a podcast and relax, but that's not the case most of the time. But if we have a podcast that we love to listen to, we're going to find a way to listen, even if that's not by using our preferred method, including preferred devices or just listening instead of watching. And if I have to go in the car and I have to drive somewhere for an hour that I wouldn't normally do, or, I have to go and do some extra work and I don't have time to go sit down and watch a podcast, well, you know what? I'm going to listen to it while I'm driving. And I think that's really the case is while we look at the preference for watching increase, it's just not always feasible for us.
Absolutely. And that's always been one of podcasting's strengths, has been that ability to take it on the go, right? It really started to some extent being perceived as on-demand radio. The thing I'll note, and we'll get into a little later, is that we can't take for granted that all new podcast consumers know this is even possible. And so we shouldn't lose sight of it for ourselves and also for podcasters. Maybe it's something to talk about with your own viewers. Let them know where else they could listen. Now, another new thing that we did with this iteration of the download. Oh, sorry, I'm getting one step ahead of it. So let me get this, and then I'm so excited for the next bit that I jumped ahead of myself. So sorry to get you all excited. We'll get to the new exciting stuff in a second. But what is important to see here, though, is that YouTube podcast consumers also say they would switch platforms. So we asked them, hey, imagine that the podcast that you access the most on YouTube, it left YouTube and was only available somewhere else. And we're starting to hear about that happening, right? So what we've heard recently is about podcasts that have signed new exclusive deals with Netflix to bring their video versions exclusively to Netflix, going off of YouTube, even while maybe the audio portion remains available in the typical audio places like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. So he said, hey, if that happens, would you follow your podcast? And a clear supermajority, 67% of those YouTube podcast consumers say, yeah, I'd follow that podcast. And that looks like a pretty good conversion rate. Let me know, it's not 100%. You'll lose maybe about a third who aren't going to leave YouTube in order to go follow that podcast somewhere else. So things to keep in mind if you're considering making that type of deal and making that type of migration, leaving YouTube to be exclusive somewhere else. And so a trend we've really been following here is the smart TV. And we're seeing it become a key device for podcast consumption. Now, we first detected this just last year, where we saw the smart TV basically become the second most used device for weekly podcast consumers in consuming podcasts. It's now ranked right behind smartphones. And what we've seen just in 1 year is a 19% growth in the number of podcast consumers telling us that they're now using smart TVs for podcasts. What do you think of that, Liz?
I think it's so interesting to see such a large growth in just a year. And I think it's what we all thought was going to happen with smart speakers. And it kind of never did. Smart speakers did have a short-lived moment, but then it kind of, went away. And
Well,
I
they
think,
flattened out, right? Like it pretty
yes,
much they hit like a growth peak, and they haven't really gone much beyond that.
exactly. And we see the same thing for smart speaker use in audio in general, not just podcasts. But I think the difference is that smart TVs are a device that you can use for more than one thing, whereas smart speakers are, you're limited to just audio, really. And I think that's why we're seeing such growth within smart TVs in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, and we can really see that in this next slide. Um, so this year, having seen the trend clear moving to people using their smart TVs for podcasts, we want to ask podcast consumers, well, what else do you do with your smart TV? Right. And, obviously we expect that they're going to tell us that they're watching YouTube, right? 2/3 of podcast consumers say, yeah, I'm watching videos from YouTube on my smart TV. Not surprising. 59% said they're watching ad supported video streaming. 58% said they're watching ad free video streaming. But they're also telling us they're consuming audio besides podcasts. 43% said that they are listening to ad supported music streaming. Let that sink in. 43% are using their TVs to listen to music. That's more than are watching linear television on their TVs, the thing the TV was designed to do. 30% are telling us they're listening to ad free music streaming, and 19% are listening to the radio on their TV. There's a band TV on the radio. Now they should change it to radio on the TV, maybe. But when we net that all together, what we find is that altogether, 57% of weekly podcast consumers are telling us that they are listening to audio on their smart TV. What is driving this, Liz?
So, Paul, I think it's a few different things. I think one of the things I mentioned is that smart TVs can be used for multiple things. And one of the things is playing music, particularly at social events. A smart TV is loud enough to cover the area of a living room, kitchen, an apartment, that you don't need to go out and buy an additional speaker. So people can now use their smart TVs to play streaming music. So they don't need to go out and buy an additional device. And especially when smart TVs are so inexpensive. So now we can start using smart TVs during social events to play music in the background. And another thing we're seeing is, particularly among the younger generation, one of the biggest things on TikTok is day in my life videos. And this is not just amongst those with large followings. People with smaller followings or little following at all are doing these types of videos. And partially, to get to the level of followers that others have. But also, I've seen people use it to use themselves to hold themselves accountable. And one of the things that a lot of these day in my life videos includes is on Sundays, people do what is known as a Sunday reset. So they'll set a timer for like an hour or so, and they'll put music or podcasts on their smart TV that they'll listen to while they clean for that set amount of time to reset for the next week. And it's just becoming part of everybody's weekly activity.
Wow. It's amazing to me. Now, for folks who maybe have remember the days when you could walk into Walmart or walk in the Best Buy and you go to the electronics section and you'd see remember these things called stereos with two big speakers all over the place, right? Big displays of them. You walk into Walmart or you walk into Best Buy today, and what do you see? You see TVs everywhere, bright TVs everywhere you look. That's the electronic device that people are getting. And it's one of these things where the industry perception, in my view, has been lagging behind what consumers are actually doing. I talked with lots of folks at South by Southwest and at Podcast Movement there this year, talking a little bit about smart TVs, telling them that this is part of our research program. And a lot of people look confounded to me and mostly said, who's doing this? This isn't something that I do or my friends do. I said, sure, but consumers are telling us, and we're seeing it trend, right, year over year. So this isn't just one outlier study. that they are using their smart TVs for podcasts. And I think this really helps to bolster the story that we're learning that podcast consumers are using them for all sorts of other audio too. It's hard to ignore this trend. And yet, not everybody is using their smart TV for podcasts. In fact, still, the majority of weekly podcast consumers are not yet using their smart TV for podcasts. And so we just want to know, hey, did you know you could do that? And turns out, yeah, they know it. 78%, a very clear majority, a strong majority, are telling us, yeah, I know that I can consume podcasts on my smart TV. Only a tiny minority said, nope, don't know it. And a few said, not sure. So the awareness is there. And awareness for the marketers out there, we know, is what starts you at the top of the funnel. And this is another exciting piece of data we have here. So a thing we wanted to try and detect here is this shift to podcasts on video streaming services. I mentioned Netflix earlier here. So we wanted to find out, how aware are weekly podcast consumers that they can consume podcasts on video streaming services? We ran this at the end of April, and Netflix pretty much debuted podcasts at the beginning of the year. So this is about 4 months in to Netflix having podcasts. Tubi also announced having podcasts like Crime Junkie, but that came a little later. So it's even a little less exposure for Tubi. And I think we were surprised that we saw that 62% of weekly podcast consumers said they're aware that they can consume podcasts on Netflix. And you see even half said on Hulu, 46% said on Apple TV, and 41% said Tubi. But we wanted to kind of dig a little deeper. So Liz, tell us how we kind of analyze this data to get underneath what might be going on.
Yeah, so Paul, you can see this total number of awareness, but then we split this out onto those who have used those services in the past month, or then more than a month ago, or even never. And you can see that the awareness for Netflix in particular jumps up to 71% for those who have used Netflix in the past month, with only 31% of people who haven't been using Netflix in the past month be aware of the service. Now, interestingly enough, Netflix isn't the highest amongst those who are using their video streaming services. Apple TV, where it was in the middle of the pack of total awareness amongst those who are using Apple TV, it jumps up to 72% being the highest.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is that the platforms are promoting podcasts. Netflix has been putting it on people's homepages now. So if you're using Netflix and you've used it in the last month and you're scrolling Netflix and scrolling Netflix and scrolling Netflix, you're going to see podcasts there. So whether you've chosen or not, it's right front and center to your awareness. And we can see that in that 40% gap. If you haven't been using Netflix recently, yeah, maybe you've heard about it, but you haven't been seeing it every time you're going, right? And what's that kind of, how many impressions is that? Well, if, someone uses Netflix every night, that's a lot of impressions. And then Apple TV's actually had podcasts for longer. Anyone who watched Severance, right, one of the biggest shows on Apple TV, saw that very often you are offered the opportunity to watch or listen to the companion podcast after the episode is over. So for a lot of their key shows, there's now been companion podcasts on Apple TV, and they, again, put that in front of you. And so they've had a lot more time to build that awareness. And we see the same sort of delta there of 34 points with Tubi. And again, Tubi, the podcast, hadn't been there for as long when we ran this survey in late April. But nevertheless, we can see that if you were on Tubi, you're more likely to have seen Crime Junkie or another podcast, and we see greater awareness there. So again, awareness is top of the funnel.
Paul, and I think you mentioned that what they're doing is they're putting it on the homepage to really showcase it. And it's actually very similar to what Spotify did when they entered the podcast game. When they entered the podcast game, Apple was dominating. So what they did was they really pushed it out front and center. Every time you logged into Spotify, it was there urging you to listen to a podcast. So it's the same kind of marketing within their tools, just we're seeing it now amongst streaming services.
Yeah, and Spotify has done the same thing when they really started to embrace video podcasting, right? Put video podcasts front and center. So, we really should not doubt the power of that homepage. That if you already have a large footprint with consumers, wide adoption and use, adding podcasts has the opportunity to grow that awareness and potentially grow the medium.
Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into the platforms themselves. So, while our questions pertaining to podcast consumption on these streaming platforms is newer, as it is newly introduced, we have been asking what streaming services people use over the past couple of years. So, we have seen since 2023 to 2026 that Netflix, Amazon Prime, they've remained pretty stable over the past couple of years. What's really interesting is Tubi. Tubi has nearly doubled in the past 3 years, going from 35% to 62% people using Tubi in April 2026. And this goes hand in hand when we look at streaming services usage for platforms. People are aware that they can use stream podcasts on Tubi because more people are using Tubi. Now we always get in the podcast industry, well, are people fatigued with their ads? Are we pushing too many ads in podcasts? Are we turning people away with these podcast ads? And the answer is surprisingly, unlike a lot of other medium, no. In fact, we see that ad tolerance has actually increased since we started asking this question in July 2017. So that top line there, you can see for 60-minute podcasts, people in July 2017 said that they thought an average of 3.6 ads for a 60-minute podcast was appropriate. That has actually increased to 4.7 ads on average for a 60-minute podcast in this past download. In that bottom line, you can see that this has also increased for 30-minute podcasts. So people in 2017 thought 2.5 ads were pretty average for a podcast. And now they're saying that you can even get up to 3.7 as an appropriate length of ads.
Podcasting is a dynamic marketplace. We are adding new consumers every single day. That's part of that growth cycle. But the thing we always have to keep in mind, those of us in the industry and who've been into podcasting for 3, 5, 10 or more years, is that when someone becomes a podcast consumer today, we're setting their baseline right now. What they're experiencing now is what they assume to be normal. And so we're sensitive, and we should be sensitive to the changes, and we should be constantly seeing our podcast listeners feeling like there are too many ads, that the ad load is too high. And I think we can often be sensitive ourselves as listeners because we're perceiving the change over time, right? We can see maybe that there's a higher ad load than what we used to hear. But when someone comes in fresh today and these are their first podcasts, that's just the baseline. So what are they comparing to? Well, they're comparing to other media. They're comparing to YouTube, to like just regular videos on YouTube. If they're radio listeners or TV consumers or CTV consumers, that's what they're comparing to. They're not comparing to podcasts because they just started with podcasts. So it's not my saying, hey, let's throw abandon to the wind. Let's just go crazy and just pack podcasts with ads. I think we still need to be careful. We need to look at the research, but it's worth noting that it seems as though consumers today are tolerant of a few more ads than they were back in 2017.
Now, another new question that we added was, what did people think about their time spent listening with indie and popular podcasts? And we see that weekly podcast consumers believe that they spend a whopping third of their time with indie podcasts. Now, what are indie versus popular podcasts? These are the definitions that respondents were given. So we have indie podcasts are podcasts that don't have a large mainstream audience, and popular podcasts are podcasts that do have a large mainstream audience. Now, it is important to note that what a mainstream audience is a very perceptual thing. And this could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So that's why we say this is what they believe that they're consuming. And we, like I said, we see that over a third of people believe that they spend, or people believe that they spend over a third of their time with indie podcasts. And in fact, this actually goes up with those who are 18 to 34, whereas consumers who are 50 plus lean more into the popular podcast realm. Now for our key takeaways. Weekly podcast consumers don't just listen to popular podcasts. They say that they spend a third of their time with indie podcasts, which means that we can spend more time focusing on rather than just focusing on popular podcasts, we need to acknowledge the indie ones as well when we think about advertising. And watchable podcasts have hit a new height in popularity. More consumers than ever before prefer podcasts with video that they can actively watch or minimize versus podcasts that are just audio. And with the rise of podcast watching, 38% of weekly podcast consumers listen via a smart TV. Smart TV usage for podcast consumption has grown 19% over the past year alone. And Netflix is off to a big start after introducing podcasts. After just introducing podcasts this year, 62% of weekly podcast consumers are already aware that they can consume podcasts on Netflix. And despite the rise of watchable podcasts, audio remains the primary mode of consumption, despite the growing option of video. Podcast consumers have the option to either watch or listen, and the vast majority, 92%, continue to choose to listen. And only a small minority, 8%, say that they only watch podcasts.
So what do we make of this? What are the recommendations we take from this data? Well, back in the fall, we said that as a podcaster, you should have a video podcast strategy. Even if that strategy is wait and see, you should be proactive and you should make it a choice. Well, today we're saying if you have a video podcast strategy, it should include smart TVs. Yes, it's an emerging trend, but signs are that using smart TVs are going to impact how consumers watch and consume their podcasts, and you should be responsive to that. And it's something we're going to continue to watch closely to help fill in that picture, to help podcasters, to help the industry better understand what this consumption pattern is looking like. You should educate your audience on all the ways they can watch and listen to your podcast. New podcast audiences are coming into a vastly changed landscape, even compared to 4 years ago. So don't assume if they're watching you on video, especially if they're watching you on an Instagram reel or watching on TikTok, that they even know you have an audio podcast, that it's even an option, or that they know why maybe they should choose that audio podcast. They need you to educate them. And we're finding that video podcast consumers on YouTube are getting through it. They're watching 75%. In fact, 3/4 are watching 75% of the podcast. People do still have attention spans, and they still do like long form, but recognizing this, and you should look at your own view through stats if you can, but recognizing this, hey, you should put your content in that first half of your episode. The things that you are key and you really want to make sure people get to and you think are what bring people to the show, put it in that first half. And independent podcasts, you have an opportunity with that younger segment. If you're going to put some effort into audience building, think about putting some emphasis there because they're telling us that they're spending more of their time with independent podcasts than the older audiences. It's an opportunity. And with that, I think we've covered everything.
We have. Thank you, Paul. Now, before we wrap up, I just want to give you a quick rundown about the Cumulus Media Westwood One Audio Active Group. We are a full service advisory for national brands, offering media planning, recommendations, creative best practices, and measurement services, in addition to webinars and studies like you have seen today. And for more information, you can visit our blog. Now you can visit us at cumulusmedia.com. If you click the blog at the bottom of the homepage, and westwood1.com/blog, or click blog at the bottom of the homepage. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Liz and Paul, for presenting all this amazing information here. So next, I think I'd like to turn to the chat and start fielding some of the questions you might have. So one question I have is, are streaming services as big for podcast users as YouTube, Spotify, or Apple?
Not
Yeah,
yet.
so I can take this one.
Okay, please.
Okay. I mean, jump in, Paul, if you think of anything else.
Yeah.
But at this moment, they aren't as big when it comes to most use. We do still see that the big three are dominating, but that doesn't mean that they won't grow into it, especially with the decline in Apple Podcasts. There's certainly an opportunity for them to grow. And particularly Netflix has only just started this year in January. So there is opportunity for them to grow into their usage. But as of right now, we are not seeing that.
Yeah, and I think it's content driven, right? There is podcast content on these services, but in terms of variety of titles, the breadth and depth of the catalog, it doesn't hold a candle to any of the big three, right? There's far more podcasts out there. So certainly Netflix can throw its promotional power behind those it's brought on as exclusives, but those aren't going to be a fit for everybody who uses Netflix, right? If you think about comparing the breadth and depth of video content on Netflix, there's kind of something there for everybody. And, it's going to have to be a similar sort of experience around podcasts, I think, for a Netflix to begin to really rival, say, YouTube for share of ear and eye.
Thanks, Paul and Liz. So next question that we have is an interesting one. Should we be making our podcasts available on Netflix?
So it's a big question. Because right now it seems like Netflix wants exclusivity, right? So, and usually exclusivity on the video portion. They seem to be fine with the audio portion continuing to be available on other platforms. So, platform exclusivity has a checkered past in podcasting. And it seems as though in many cases that kind of exclusivity has meant a limitation on audience development. Now, Netflix has been putting cash on the table for a lot of these podcasters. So, I'm not here to advise you to turn down cash, but it's something to think about, right? What we saw in these results is that, 2/3 of YouTube podcast consumers, said they'd follow their podcast, somewhere else, or so, right around in that area. But so actually more of a clear majority would follow their podcast, that stat, but we still find about a third, wouldn't. So you have to kind of weigh what is that potential loss of eyeballs on YouTube of people who aren't going to follow you against the possible gains on Netflix.
Thanks, Paul. see if there are any more questions. All right, well, there's no more questions. I'd like to thank everybody for joining this webinar this afternoon. And as a reminder, a video of this webinar and a copy of the report will be sent to all attendees next week. So thanks. Yeah.
Mike, I do see a few
Oh, you
questions.
do? Sorry, maybe
Yeah.
I'm
Um,
unable, maybe.
I can read them.
We've
We
got one more
have,
question.
how much
Yeah.
impact is there with video on Apple Podcasts and Apple TV?
So I think as of yet, we're still yet to detect very much. It was a very new thing when we went to field. We fielded the study at the end of April. So I don't think as of yet we have a lot of signals. It's something we'll be watching. The thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned with Apple before, is that, when you're talking about, the Apple Podcast app, or you're talking about Apple TV, you're talking about overall a smaller user base, potential user base, than you were talking about for, say, YouTube very specifically, or Spotify. So I think it's going to have, less significant impacts overall right now on the podcast consumer, on the broad set of podcast consumers, simply because of that smaller share, in part because it's exclusive to very specific devices. But we will try to continue to watch it, especially on Apple TV, with regard to the video component, which as of today isn't available on my smart TV via an Apple product. And I see a follow-up question here. I'll read it. Will HLS give monetization opportunity that will attract the larger creators? I mean, I think so. Obviously that monetization opportunity depends on eyeballs, right? It is going to be directly related to the viewers. So what is, I think, something that an obligation we can put on Apple's shoulders is growing and regrowing their share of the podcast consumption, of once again making their platform, Apple Podcasts as an app, or possibly Apple TV as an app, a destination for more podcast consumers. If they can grow that, then obviously that grows the monetization opportunity, but you can't monetize eyeballs that aren't watching. And that's, it's too early to possibly say. And as I said earlier, podcasting is a dynamic marketplace. So we don't know what we're going to see in a year, and I'm not going to hazard a guess about what we will see in that year. I think, is that about it?
Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, well, thanks again, everyone. I'll remind everyone again, a video of this webinar and a copy of the report will be sent to all attendees next week. So thanks so much, everyone. Till next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.